Welcome to the 12th District. I'm Kerry Condata for NCW Life TV. A big week in Olympia. It's the opening week, and over 800 bills have already been dropped in the hopper. It's off to a hot start. We'll be with Representative Gaynor and Steele in just a few minutes to get caught up on the first week in Olympia. The Supreme Court this week will also hear the capital gains bill. They will have the original hearings. That decision won't be made for several months, but that will determine whether an income tax is coming in Washington State or not. Already a bill has been filed to drop the $250,000 limit on capital gains and increase the rate as predicted. This is a step, it's basically a step to an full income tax in Washington State, and they're already moving on it before the court even rules. We'll have more on that as it develops. More layoffs, more store closings. We'll talk about that in our economic segment. And the most ridiculous story of the week, Bob Ferguson, our AG, coming to Wenatchee to tell us about shoplifting. Frankly, it was him, his governor, and his legislature that put the police reforms in effect that created all the shoplifting. So it should be very interesting to see how Bob defends himself against his own policies. And last but not least, the final word today, there will be an event here in Wenatchee. Also, for those of you that were negatively affected by Washington's COVID policies, we'll tell you about that at the end of the show. If you were negatively affected by COVID policies, including closures, shutdowns, vaccine mandates and such, we'll tell you where you should be for this meeting. We'll be right back with a short newscast, and then our state representatives will be with us. Welcome back. Well, we'll have Mike and Keith with us in just a few minutes to talk about what's going on in Olympia. There's a lot going on down there. For right now, let's take a quick look at the economy, what's happening. The latest inflation numbers from December look like things are tapering off a bit. It hasn't gone away, but it is starting to flatten off. We're seeing actually a slight decrease in some prices, although you wouldn't know it from the price of eggs. That is the most talked about commodity in the last week or two, as they have risen dramatically for various reasons. But food prices are still a problem. What has really pulled the core rate down is energy prices, but that's about to change as well. Oil prices hit a new high, about a 7-month high over the weekend, so expect that prices on energy will start to climb again, and that may refuel some of the inflation fears that we have had. Interest rates next week, the Federal Reserve will meet and decide on another interest rate hike. There is a lot of people betting on whether it'll be 0.25 or 0.50. I guess we'll wait and find out, but there will be another increase. From all indications, they're not done. The inflation rate is still well above the 2% target rate. Stocks are all over the place. They've had a little bit of a good start in January, but now going the other way. The market's probably going to find direction after this next rate increase. If it's 0.50, I suspect things won't look good in the stock market, but if it's 0.25, that may signal a reduction in the Fed's movement, and therefore keep stocks at least floating, if not some gains forward. Big layoffs this week all across the board. Microsoft announcing 10,000 people leaving. They're going to be laying off. And of course, Amazon, 18,000 more. Salesforce and others are doing the same massive tech layoffs across the nation, certainly going to have an effect. And that brings us to the chances of a recession, which were 50-50 a few months ago, and then they were 55-45, and now it's looking more like 65-35 when all the pros get together and say it's not looking good. As a matter of fact, the World Economic Forum over in Davos, Switzerland, is just wrapped up, and the odds there were quite high. The general consensus among all the members of the various countries around the world is that we're in a tight spot. Of course, they're still concerned with climate change, still concerned with the war in Ukraine and Russia, and but the biggest single issue that came out of that group was the cost of living. This inflationary situation for food and energy particularly causing the cost of living to go up dramatically, lowering the level of living, lowering the standards of living for many people around the world. So lots more economic news to come in the next few weeks. We'll be covering that as well as the political side. But we are in a very interesting environment right now. I think the Federal Reserve will probably continue to tighten, and I think the recession is probably coming upon us. How bad it will be is yet to be seen, but we'll be tracking it every week, keeping you informed. We'll be right back with our state representatives to see what's going on in Olympia. That's Representative Gaynor and Steele. Will be right with us after these messages. Welcome back to the 12th District. Well, as promised, we have connected back with our two House representatives in Olympia, and it is definitely in Olympia. We can see out the window there. It looks like the weather there is better than it is here, guys. I had a pretty good first week for weather down there, I hear.
We've gotten plenty of rain.
Oh, well, that's standard operating procedure in Olympia. So tell us, how was your first week?
Well, it was pretty aggressive, quite honestly. I mean, it's definitely nice to be back in person, but you sort of forget about the rigors of the schedule and getting used to that, and just from early in the morning till late in the evening, and you're running constantly, and you just don't have the same sort of stamina, I guess, that you had a couple of years ago. So we're getting used to it again.
It has been, interesting. We've had a few bills that were pretty innocuous, but yesterday we had a couple of bills that are pretty fundamentally earth-changing, I guess, in a sense. And one had to do with, the climate as part of the Growth Management Act, and another one has to do with recycling. And when you have bills that are like 45 pages long, and the other one's 143 pages long, and you only have a 2 hours limit at the max of testimony, we're talking about some pretty fundamental changes to the way things are in the state. And we really don't have a lot of time to discuss all the implications. So I think we've got some other bills. Yesterday there were some gun hearing bills that had a number of people here. And of course, with the remote testimony, there's no lack of testifiers. So it's a little bit different. This is, from what we've had the last couple of years, but it sure is good to be back in person and meeting with people.
Well, that's a fact. As of this interview, there has been over 800 bills introduced in just the first couple of weeks. That is pretty amazing. To put that in contrast, over in Idaho, they've introduced 20 bills. So Olympia, once again, is on a holy tear with paperwork. Tell us, Keith, since you mentioned it, that's one of the biggest bills, the most talked about bills were the gun bills this week. You say there was a good turnout for the hearing?
Well, they were lined up, but not as many as we've had, and I think I attribute that to the fact that people are testifying online. They were not in my committee, so I'm not sure exactly which specific bills were on there, but there's about, I think there's at least 4 or 5 that will have, will have a lot of discussion, because they are, once again, changing some of the rights and that we have in the state.
Well, the sheriffs have signed a letter, almost all the sheriffs in Washington State. I think there's only a handful that have not participated, saying they believe those bills, or most of them, are unconstitutional, have no intention of enforcing them. So I'm sure that the Sheriff's Department, hopefully the Sheriff's Department showed up to talk about that.
Well, as Representative Gaynor mentioned, it's not a committee that either of us sit on, but we'll be definitely tracking those bills. And we've heard from a lot of constituents back home how they feel about those bills. And obviously there's a lot of passion on both sides of this issue, and as is evident by the lineup for folks to testify both for and against. It'll be interesting to see how those bills come out of committee, if they do indeed come out of committee, and then it is a major priority of the governor, as he heard in his opening State of the State address. He wants to get this gun legislation passed, but it has, there are major ramifications. And again, I think we do have to be mindful of the Constitution in this conversation. And I also think we have to be worried about what we're doing to some of the businesses that deal in firearms, that creating liability for them. I just don't think is the right way to go. So we have to figure out some of this stuff and be pretty focused on how we deal with it.
think you guys have hit on two of the biggest topics in this session. Is going to be the gun control issues, at least from the folks on this side, and the environmental issues. A couple of those bills you talked about, Keith, they're pretty major. Can you give us kind of an overview of where they're going with this?
Well, I'm kind of wondering myself where we're going with these, because the bills as heard, I don't think will be approved, come out of committee with the same, impact that they've been introduced. Because, when you have a bill that, as I said, there was 143 pages, I mean, there's a lot of things that are being addressed. And right now, in the state of Washington, we actually have some of the best recycling rates. And the thing that is concerning to me is that they haven't really, in drafting these bills, they haven't really dealt with the people that are doing the business of recycling. And so they're putting restrictions and making, in fact, we heard from a couple of them that said, if this bill passes, we will be out of business. Now, that's kind of shooting yourself in the foot when you have people that are committed to recycling and then have restrictions that make it difficult for them to actually be successful in that endeavor. As it relates to the climate change bills, as I mentioned, it really fundamentally reimagines the Growth Management Act, and that's been in place for 30 years, and we haven't found the success by the legislation that, at least the way it was rolled out, the way it was intended. And I believe that these changes, although they're well-meaning, they really do have significant impact on how you plan and design your communities for the future. And I think it's really important for us to be very careful what kinds of restrictions we're going to place on local communities.
Well, I think that really plays into the bigger discussion that's happening around housing here in the legislature. We talk all the time about affordability and how we create more housing in our communities, and yet here we are, debating and contemplating additional regulation on how housing gets put out and laid out in these communities, and that will not help drive the cost down. As you know, Carrie, it will drive the cost up and make housing less affordable, and again create housing problems for the working folks in our communities and the folks who are barely able to afford them anyway. I can tell you that they're not concerned with how GMA is laid out or how they just want to be housed. That's, I think, where we should be focusing. We shouldn't be looking for ways to make it more complicated, more costly, more permitting, more regulatory. We should be looking for ways to make it efficient and to make sure that those who are most vulnerable are getting housed.
Well, there's certainly a slew of bills around homelessness. Oregon has identified it. The new governor has identified it as their #1 issue, and I think it's right at the top of the list on Washington, too. Is there anything you've seen in that slew of bills on homelessness that moves the right direction or that will actually help? Because what we've seen so far isn't very promising.
Well, as I talked to folks this morning around this issue, this is a major capital budget issue with the governor wanting to go outside the debt limit to pay for some of this stuff. Money is not always the solution. In fact, the governor has just named it a crisis while he's been in office for how many years? And we've seen the homelessness and housing problem just get worse and worse and worse. And now he wants a blank check to try and solve the problem, when I believe there are programmatic issues, there are wraparound services we need to be worried about, there are other things we need to be focused on in terms of mental health and addiction. It's not just about writing a check and buying more properties and building more facilities. It's truly about trying to help these people get better, feel better, be better in society, and give them the tools to succeed. And that's not just buying hotels and putting them in rooms.
Well, there was a headline this week also that said the fentanyl deaths in homeless camps are off the charts. So we know that the base root of some of this is addiction, and fentanyl is a big part of it. I haven't seen anything in Olympia to address the fentanyl issue. Have you?
I haven't seen anything, no.
No, but we are going to be meeting with some Chelan County Sheriff's officers over this week to talk about what they're seeing in terms of fentanyl and the laws that we continue to pass here in Olympia that decriminalize some of this stuff and make it easier for folks to pass it out and have it is not helpful to our police officers who are boots on the ground dealing with this stuff. And so part of that meeting this week will be, what are they seeing? How are they able to address it? How are they not? What laws here in Olympia that we've created make their jobs harder. I really think we have to spend more time in practical ways dealing with folks who are, connecting with folks who are dealing with these problems in our communities and giving them the tools they need to be successful, because taking tools away and making it more difficult to do their jobs makes our streets less safe, makes our communities less safe, and gives criminals more access to drugs, money, and theft.
Well, I hope the police guild or the various police agencies are there in full force, because you're absolutely right. We need those reforms absolutely reformed, including pursuit, which was the #1 most signed initiative out of that last initiative package that went around. That was the biggest concern. But there was another one in that package that was interesting, and that's governor's emergency powers. I understand that there's been bills introduced, but no movement on reining in the governor's powers. Is that what you've seen so far?
Yes, from what we know, nothing has been scheduled for hearing.
Yeah, that makes sense. There is another concern of people in Washington State is voter integrity, and I find it just amazing that a bill was introduced this week to eliminate the signatures. It's bad enough we don't have ID, but now they have a bill to erase the signatures. The Republican State Party has already signed on to a lawsuit against that. Are you familiar with that, and do you think that's something that actually has legs?
Well, it's probably going through state government. Once again, it's not a committee that we serve on, but I don't quite understand how that would make it through. However, I've been surprised at a number of things. But to me, we have to have ID. We have to be someone does need to prove they're a citizen, and I guess that seems going against the whole idea of the integrity in the election.
Yeah, I would certainly agree. I was just appalled when I saw that. I mean, given it's such a big subject matter and people are so concerned, that's a real slap in the face coming from the folks in Olympia. All right, gentlemen, we've got a few more minutes. Anything that you're working on that you want to tell us about right out of the chute here, concerns or bills, tell us what you got.
Well, from my perspective, it's probably going to be more of what we've just talked about, because there's a lot of variations on the themes that we've mentioned. The one thing that will be interesting for me will be in transportation. We'll be talking about the governor's transportation budget, which really does not align with what the House and the Senate came up with. We've had a number of projects that have been postponed. Probably one of significance to the Wenatchee area has to do with the Confluence Parkway. There was money that theoretically was there. It doesn't appear to be right now in the near future. And so that will have an impact on discussions, I'm sure, within the city of Wenatchee and with the Chelan County PUD.
Yeah, I got a kick out of the, excuse me, Mike. I just got a kick out of the argument over the north-south Spokane freeway, defunding that again. And why I think that's a bit of a chuckle is they were doing that argument 20 years ago when I was there. The north-south freeway has been funded and unfunded literally every session for as long as I can remember. It gets a little bit crazy. Mike, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to mention that the bulk of the work that I'm doing right now is just digging into this bond initiative that the governor has around, going outside the debt limit and making sure that we have a very clear understanding of what that means and what the ramifications for all the taxpayers in Washington State are. $4 billion is not a small amount of money. And we really need to be able to understand and articulate to our constituents what the governor's plan is and how it would work going forward. Housing will be the theme of the session. Outside of the more controversial bills, housing is going to be one of the most costly things that we do here in Olympia. And then serving on the Appropriations Committee, looking at the governor's proposal of nearly $70 billion for general fund operations is staggering. I mean, it just keeps leaping up and up by the tune of billions of dollars every biennium, and it's just, unfortunately, our constituents' households are not doing the same thing. Their revenues are not jumping by billions of dollars every biennium. So we have to be careful on how we spend this money and how we answer to the taxpayers.
Well, and speaking of taxes, as expected, there was a bill also introduced to eliminate what hasn't even happened technically, and that is the capital gains tax is going to court next week. and it'll be heard in the Supreme Court. There will be a decision somewhere down the road, but the governor is calculating that money, already counting it as coming in. The state is enforcing it as until the courts say otherwise. But as expected, there was a bill dropped to drop the $250,000 limit and to raise the rate before it's even approved by the Supreme Court. Now, we predicted that this was just an opening of the door. Oh, it's only going to tax the rich people. Everything's only above $250,000. Well, now they're talking about eliminating that and raising the rate. I just can't even imagine where they're going with this.
Well, they're working really hard to find new revenue to pay for all the new programs they want to create and entitlements they want to build. And, I think, your viewers know, Carrie, that Keith and I are very interested and compassionate folks about helping people in our communities. We want to do that, but we should focus on the programs we've built, make sure they're fully funded before we develop new ones, make sure that the folks who have been dependent on the programs we created are going to be able to be sustained, before we build new things. And so it's always a little frustrating that we, one session after the next, we come up with new ideas and we abandon the programs that we thought were going to solve the problems the last time around and go on to something new. So.
Well, that's a fact, and I was just going to say that we are also facing more and more. The odds are of a pretty substantial recession ahead. We're seeing those odds increase almost every day. The International Economic Forum in Switzerland is saying the odds are much higher than it was a few months ago. So that lovely revenue stream won't last forever.
One thing I was going to say, though, with regard to that capital gains tax, the fact that it is been determined to be unconstitutional. Obviously, it's being appealed and all, but what it points out is that there really isn't a respect for the system and the different branches of government. There is a committee that is supposed to be looking at things that when legislation does not meet the intent, the way it's being carried out, that should be visiting that and making sure that we're not stepping outside our responsibilities as a legislative branch. But we've seen it from the executive branch and hopefully not from the judicial, but we have had some rulings that where there actually is legislation from the bench. And I think it's really important for us to understand that this system of government was set up with three branches of government with the balances, in the respective responsibilities. And I don't see at this point where there's a respect for that.
I certainly would agree. All right, gentlemen, we've run out of time for this week. I thank you for being with us. We will come back next week and see what's up. It sounds like it's just going to get worse, but we'll be following it along the way. Thanks a lot for being with us today.
Thanks,
Gary.
Welcome back. Well, there you have it from our representatives in Olympia. Lots going on. We'll be following that every week, or at least most of the weeks of the session coming up. As promised, the last word of the day, an event here in Wenatchee coming up. Pandemic Response Harms Listening Session will be hosted by John Stockton, NBA Hall of Famer, and it's put on by the Truth and Accountability Project here in Washington State. It will be also locally hosted by our very own Bill Sullivan from the Chelan and Douglas County Health Board, and it will deal with vaccine issues, mandates, masking issues, hospital issues, locks down, schools closures, and that type of thing. It will be on the 28th in the afternoon. That's Saturday the 28th. And more information is available online. All right, that's it for today for the 12th District. Don't forget our news at 5, 6, and 10 o'clock. We'll see you next week. Thanks for listening.